The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Arizona desert as Maria Santos adjusted the heavy pack on her shoulders. The year was 1886, and the Apache Wars had been raging for decades. What nobody knew as they watched the young Mexican woman prepare for her journey was that she carried more than supplies in her weathered leather satchel. Hidden beneath layers of cornmeal and dried meat was a secret that could change the course of history. Maria had lived on the border between two worlds her entire life. Her small adobe house sat just outside the military fort, close enough to hear the bugle calls each morning, yet far enough to maintain the privacy she desperately needed. The soldiers knew her as a reliable scout and translator, someone who could navigate both the harsh desert landscape and the complex relationships between the various Apache bands and the U.S. military. But Maria carried a burden that weighed heavier than any pack she had ever shouldered. 3 months earlier, she had made a promise that now seemed impossible to keep. The memory of that night still haunted her dreams. She had been returning from a trading expedition when she heard the gunfire echoing through the canyon walls. By the time she reached the source of the commotion, the battle was over. The scene that greeted her was one of devastating loss. A small Apache camp had been attacked, not by soldiers, but by a rival band seeking to settle old grievances. Bodies lay scattered among the burning wickiups, and the air was thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. Maria moved carefully through the destruction, her heart breaking with each step. That's when she found him. Tucked behind an overturned water basket, a small boy, no more than 8 years old, lay unconscious. Blood matted his thick black hair, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Maria knelt beside him, checking for other injuries. A deep gash ran along his left arm, and his leg was bent at an unnatural angle. But it wasn't his physical wounds that made Maria gasp when she finally got a clear look at his face. She recognized him immediately. This was no ordinary Apache child. This was the son of Naiche, the hereditary chief of the Chiricahua Apache and one of the most wanted men in the American Southwest. The boy's features bore the unmistakable resemblance to his father, and Maria knew that his presence here meant something had gone terribly wrong with the peace negotiations that had been taking place in secret. For weeks, rumors had circulated that Naiche was considering surrender. The great Apache leader Geronimo had already been captured and sent into exile, and many of the remaining Apache bands were running out of options. The constant pursuit by the military, combined with dwindling supplies and safe territories, had pushed many to the breaking point. Naiche had been one of the last holdouts, but even he was beginning to see the writing on the wall. Maria had been serving as an unofficial intermediary in these delicate discussions. Her unique position as someone trusted by both sides made her invaluable in the complex dance of diplomacy that preceded any potential surrender. She had carried messages back and forth, translated not just words but cultural nuances, and helped both sides understand the other's perspectives. Now, as she looked down at the unconscious boy, Maria realized that everything had changed. The attack on the camp had not been random. Someone had wanted to send a message, and that message was clear. There would be no peace, no negotiation, no surrender. The war would continue until every Apache was dead or captured. But Maria also understood something else as she gently lifted the boy into her arms. If Naiche's son was here, alone and injured, it meant that his father was likely dead or captured. The boy was now not just a victim of the attack, but potentially the last hope for his people's survival. The knowledge he carried about Apache hideouts, water sources, and escape routes was invaluable. In the wrong hands, it could lead to the complete destruction of the remaining free Apache bands. Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Instead of taking the boy to the military fort, where he would certainly be interrogated and likely sent to the prison camps in Florida, she carried him to her own home. For 3 days and nights, she nursed him back to consciousness, treating his wounds with a combination of traditional Mexican remedies and Apache healing practices she had learned over the years. When the boy finally opened his eyes, Maria saw a mixture of fear and defiance that reminded her powerfully of his father. He spoke only Apache at first, refusing to acknowledge that he understood Spanish or English, though Maria suspected he was fluent in both. She didn't push him. Instead, she continued to care for him, bringing him food and water, changing his bandages, and slowly gaining his trust. It was on the 4th day that the boy finally spoke to her in broken Spanish. His name was Taza, named after his grandfather, and he confirmed what Maria had already suspected. His father had been captured during a failed attempt to negotiate with a cavalry unit that had been sent to arrest him. The attack on the camp had been carried out by Apache scouts working for the military, men who had turned against their own people in exchange for promises of safety and supplies. Tarza's story was heartbreaking. He had been traveling with a small group of his father's most trusted warriors when they were betrayed by someone they thought was a friend. The group had been led into an ambush, and in the chaos that followed, Tarza had been separated from the others. He had wandered for 2 days before collapsing at the camp where Maria found him. But there was more to the story, something that Tarza was reluctant to share. Maria could see it in his eyes, the way he would start to speak and then stop himself. She knew that patience would be required to earn the complete trust of this traumatized child, and she was prepared to wait as long as necessary. Meanwhile, the search for the missing Apache boy had begun in earnest. Military patrols scoured the desert, following every lead and questioning every person they encountered. They knew that Naichi had a son, and they suspected that the boy might have information that could help them locate the remaining Apache strongholds. The bounty on Tarza's head grew larger with each passing day. Maria found herself in an increasingly dangerous position. Each morning brought new challenges as she tried to keep Tarza's presence in her home a secret while continuing her normal activities. She had to maintain her cover as a loyal army scout and translator, while secretly harboring one of the most wanted individuals in the territory. The boy's injuries were healing, but slowly. His broken leg required weeks of careful attention, and the head wound had left him with periods of dizziness and confusion. Maria improvised a hidden room in her home, using false walls and carefully placed furniture to create a space where Tarza could remain concealed, even if soldiers searched her house. Food became a constant concern. Maria had always been careful with her supplies, but now she was feeding 2 people while trying to make it look like she was only feeding 1. She began making longer trips to the trading posts, claiming she needed extra provisions for extended scouting expeditions. The stories she told became increasingly elaborate as she tried to explain her changing patterns of behavior. It was during one of these supply runs that Maria overheard a conversation that chilled her to the bone. 2 cavalry officers were discussing plans for a final campaign against the remaining Apache bands. They had received word that several groups were planning to surrender, but the military commanders wanted to make sure there would be no future uprisings. The solution they had devised was brutal in its simplicity. They would accept the surrenders, then send every Apache man, woman, and child to prison camps in Florida, where they would remain indefinitely. Maria realized that her initial instincts had been correct. There was no honor in the surrender being offered to the Apache people. It was a trap designed to eliminate them as a people forever. The children would be separated from their parents, the elderly would die in the unfamiliar climate, and the warriors would waste away in captivity. It would be genocide disguised as mercy. This knowledge added new urgency to Maria's situation. She could no longer simply hide Tarza until his injuries healed. She had to find a way to get him to safety, to a place where he could grow up free, and perhaps one day lead his people back to their ancestral lands. But where could an Apache boy find such safety in 1886? The answer came to Maria in a flash of inspiration, as she remembered stories her grandmother had told her about the Mexican Apache bands that lived in the Sierra Madre Mountains. These groups had never been conquered by either the Mexican or American armies. They lived in some of the most remote and inaccessible terrain on the continent, and they had maintained their traditional way of life despite decades of pressure from both governments. If she could get Tarza to these Mexican Apache bands, he would be safe. More than that, he would be able to learn the traditional ways of his people and perhaps one day return to lead the scattered remnants of the Chiricahua Apache. But the journey would be incredibly dangerous. It would mean crossing hundreds of miles of hostile territory, avoiding both American and Mexican military patrols, and navigating some of the most treacherous desert terrain in North America. Maria spent sleepless nights planning the journey. She would have to abandon her home, her livelihood, and everything she had built over the years. There would be no coming back once she made this choice. She would be branded a traitor by the American military and hunted as a fugitive. But when she looked at Tarza, still weak from his injuries but showing flashes of the strength and intelligence that would one day make him a leader, she knew she had no choice. The decision became even more urgent when Maria learned that a new search party was being organized specifically to find Tarza. Intelligence reports had confirmed that Naichi's son had survived the attack on the camp, and the military was determined to find him. They had brought in Apache scouts from other tribes, men who were skilled at tracking and who knew the boy by sight. Maria knew she was running out of time. Tarza's leg was still not fully healed and he couldn't travel long distances on foot. She would have to find another way to transport him, and she would have to do it soon. The solution came from an unexpected source. One of her regular contacts at the trading post mentioned that a group of Mexican traders was preparing to head south with a large pack train. They were traveling to the mining towns in Sonora, following routes that would take them close to the Sierra Madre Mountains. It was exactly the opportunity Maria had been hoping for, but it would require perfect timing and a great deal of luck. The traders were known to be sympathetic to the Apache people, having established peaceful trading relationships with several bands over the years. Maria had done business with them before, and she believed they might be willing to help if they understood the situation. But approaching them would be risky. If they refused to help or if word of her request reached the wrong ears, both she and Tarza would be doomed. Maria spent 2 days working up the courage to approach the lead trader, a weathered Mexican man named Don Carlos who had been making these journeys for more than 20 years. When she finally found the right moment to speak with him privately, she was surprised by his reaction. Rather than showing shock or fear when she explained her situation, Don Carlos simply nodded as if he had been expecting this conversation. "I wondered when someone would come to me with such a request," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "The boy you speak of, he is the son of Naichi, yes? I knew his father when we were both young men. Naichi once saved my life during an Apache raid on a rival trading party. I owe him a debt that I have never been able to repay." The relief Maria felt was overwhelming. Not only was Don Carlos willing to help, but he had personal reasons for doing so that went beyond simple sympathy. They quickly worked out the details of the plan. Maria and Tarza would join the pack train as additional guards, a common practice that wouldn't attract attention. Maria's reputation as a scout and her knowledge of the territory would actually make their presence an asset to the group, but there was still the challenge of getting Tarza to the rendezvous point without being detected. The pack train was assembling at a trading post 15 miles south of Maria's home, and the journey would have to be made at night to avoid the patrols that swept the area during daylight hours. Maria spent the next week making careful preparations. She cached supplies along the route they would take, hiding water and food in locations that only she knew about. She studied the patrol schedules, timing her own movements to avoid detection while gathering the intelligence she would need to plan their escape route. The most difficult part was preparing Tarza for the journey. His leg was still weak, and he would need to be able to ride for long distances without complaint. Maria began a careful program of exercises and short trips around her property, building up the boy's strength while teaching him the skills he would need to blend in with the pack train. During these preparations, Tarza finally shared the complete secret he had been holding back. His father had not simply been captured randomly. Before his arrest, Naichi had hidden a cache of items that represented the cultural heritage of the Chiricahua Apache people. Sacred objects, historical records kept on pieces of hide, and most importantly, a detailed map showing the locations of hidden springs and secret trails throughout Apache territory. This cache was hidden somewhere in the Dragoon Mountains, in a location known only to Naichi and now to his son. If the American military found these items, they would be able to hunt down every remaining Apache band within months. But if the cache could be retrieved and taken to safety, it would preserve the cultural knowledge of the Chiricahua people for future generations. Tarza had memorized the location before his father's capture, but he was the only person left alive who knew where to find it. This knowledge made him far more than just another Apache refugee. He was the keeper of his people's most precious secrets, and the responsibility weighed heavily on his young shoulders. The revelation added a new dimension to their escape plan. Not only did they need to get Tarza to safety, but they would also need to find a way to retrieve the hidden cache. The Dragoon Mountains were hundreds of miles from their destination in Mexico, and they were heavily patrolled by cavalry units specifically looking for Apache hideouts. Maria realized that their journey would have to include a dangerous detour. They would travel south with the pack train until they were clear of the immediate search area, then break away and head east toward the Dragoons. After retrieving the cache, they would have to make their way back south to Mexico, this time carrying precious cargo that could not be replaced if lost. The plan was ambitious to the point of being nearly impossible, but Maria could see no alternative. The cultural heritage of the Chiricahua Apache was too important to leave in a cave where it might never be found again. Future generations of Apache people would need these records and artifacts to maintain their connection to their ancestors and their traditional ways. As the departure date approached, Maria found herself struggling with emotions she hadn't expected. She was leaving behind the only life she had ever known, embarking on a journey that would likely end in her death or capture. But she was also filled with a sense of purpose that she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she was doing something that truly mattered, something that would echo through history long after she was gone. The night before their departure, Maria sat with Taza in her kitchen, sharing a simple meal and talking quietly about what lay ahead. The boy had grown stronger during his time in her care, not just physically but emotionally as well. The traumatized child she had found unconscious in the destroyed camp was being replaced by a young man who understood his destiny and was prepared to face it with courage. "Why are you doing this for me?" Taza asked, speaking in English for the first time since his arrival. His voice was steady, but Maria could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Maria considered her answer carefully. How could she explain to an 8-year-old boy the complex mixture of guilt, compassion, and determination that drove her decision? How could she make him understand that his survival represented something larger than either of their individual lives? "Because someone must," she finally replied. "Your father was a great leader who fought to protect his people. Now it falls to you to carry that responsibility forward. I cannot fight the way your father fought, but I can help ensure that his son lives to continue the struggle in his own way." Taza nodded solemnly, accepting her answer without further question. In that moment, Maria saw a glimpse of the leader he would one day become, assuming they could survive the trials that lay ahead. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind blowing down from the mountains. Maria made her final preparations, gathering the supplies they would need and making sure no trace of Taza's presence remained in her home. She left a letter for the fort commander, explaining that she was taking an extended leave to visit family in Mexico. It was a thin excuse that wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, but it might buy them a few extra days before the search began in earnest. As the sun reached its peak, Maria and Taza began their journey south toward the rendezvous point with the pack train. They traveled on foot, with Taza riding on a small burro that Maria had acquired for the purpose. To any casual observer, they looked like a Mexican woman and her son heading to market, a common sight in the border regions. But both Maria and Taza knew that their real journey was just beginning. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of hostile territory, dangerous adversaries, and challenges that would test them beyond anything they had ever faced. The secret cache in the Dragoon Mountains waited for them, holding the keys to preserving Apache culture for future generations. And beyond that, if they survived, lay the promise of safety in the remote mountains of Mexico. As they walked through the desert afternoon, Maria found herself thinking about the strange turns that life could take. Just a few months ago, she had been a simple scout and translator, content with her quiet life on the border between two worlds. Now she was embarking on a quest that would either save the cultural heritage of an entire people or result in her death in some lonely desert canyon. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but Maria discovered that she welcomed it. For too long, she had lived as an observer of the great events unfolding around her. Now she was a participant, someone whose actions would help shape the future of the American Southwest. Whatever happened in the days and weeks to come, she knew she was finally living a life that mattered. The pack train stretched out across the desert like a giant serpent, its components moving in perfect harmony, despite the harsh terrain. Maria had been traveling with Don Carlos and his men for 2 weeks now, and she marveled at how smoothly the operation functioned. The traders had been making this journey for so many years that every detail had been refined to near perfection. Taza had adapted to life on the trail better than Maria had dared to hope. His injuries were healing well, and his natural Apache instincts for desert survival served him well in the challenging conditions. The other members of the pack train had accepted him as Maria's nephew, a story that explained his presence without raising uncomfortable questions about his true identity. But Maria knew their time with the safety of the group was running short. They were approaching the point where they would need to break away and head east toward the Dragoon Mountains. The thought of leaving the relative security of the pack train filled her with anxiety, but she knew there was no choice. The sacred cache hidden by Naichi was too important to abandon. Don Carlos had been watching for the right opportunity to discuss the separation privately with Maria. That evening, as the pack train made camp beside a small spring, he approached her while the others were busy with their evening chores. "Tomorrow we reach the crossroads," he said quietly. settling down beside the small fire where Maria was preparing their evening meal. "Are you certain you want to go through with this plan? The dragoons are crawling with cavalry patrols and they're all looking for Apache survivors from the recent campaigns." Maria stirred the pot of beans she was cooking, considering her words carefully. "The boy carries knowledge that cannot be lost," she replied. "His father entrusted him with secrets that are essential to preserving Apache culture. We must retrieve what was hidden, regardless of the risks." Don Carlos nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I understand the importance of what you're attempting, but I fear for your safety. The desert between here and the dragoons is unforgiving, and the soldiers patrolling that area have orders to shoot Apache on sight. They may not take time to ask questions before acting." "That is a chance we must take," Maria said firmly. "Tarza's people have lost so much already. Their land, their freedom, their leaders. We cannot allow them to lose their history as well." The old trader studied her face in the firelight, seeing the determination there. "Very well. I will provide you with extra supplies and 2 of my best horses. They are desert bred and can travel long distances without water. But I want you to promise me something in return." "What is that?" "If you run into trouble, if you find yourself cornered with no escape, you will abandon this mission and flee to safety. The boy's life is more important than any cache of artifacts." His father would have wanted him to survive, not to die trying to preserve objects that may already be lost. Maria promised, though she knew in her heart that she would never abandon the mission, regardless of the consequences. She had committed herself to this path, and she would see it through to the end. That night, as the pack train slept under the desert stars, Maria lay awake planning the details of their separation. They would leave before dawn, while the traders were still breaking camp. Don Carlos had provided her with a map showing the location of known water sources along their route, as well as the positions of recent cavalry patrols. It was invaluable intelligence, but Maria knew that patrol patterns could change without warning. She had also spent considerable time studying the information Tarza had shared about the location of his father's cache. According to the boy, the hiding place was in a remote canyon on the eastern edge of the Dragoon Mountains, marked by a distinctive rock formation that resembled a crouching jaguar. The cache itself was hidden in a cave behind a waterfall, protected by both the difficult terrain and the Apache belief that the location was sacred. The journey to the Dragoons would take them approximately 4 days if they traveled steadily and encountered no delays. The return trip to rejoin their southward journey would take another 4 days, assuming they could retrieve the cache without incident. 8 days of exposure to cavalry patrols, Apache scouts working for the military, and the countless other dangers that lurked in the desert. Before sunrise, Maria gently woke Tarza and began their preparations for departure. They moved quietly, gathering their supplies and saddling the horses Don Carlos had provided. The animals were indeed magnificent specimens, clearly bred for endurance and desert travel. Their dark coats would help them blend into the rocky terrain they would be crossing. Don Carlos appeared just as they were ready to leave, carrying a leather satchel that he pressed into Maria's hands. "Emergency supplies," he explained, "and something else that might prove useful." He opened the satchel to reveal a pair of military field glasses and a detailed map of the Dragoon Mountains that was far more precise than anything Maria had seen before. "Where did you get this?" she asked, examining the map with amazement. The detail was extraordinary, showing not just the major geographic features but also hidden trails, water sources, and even some of the cave systems that honeycombed the mountains. "I have many friends in many places," Don Carlos replied with a slight smile. "Some wear uniforms, some wear feathers, and some wear the simple clothes of people trying to survive in difficult times. Information flows both ways along these trading routes, and sometimes that information can save lives." Maria understood immediately. The old trader was part of an informal network that extended throughout the borderlands, connecting people who might normally be enemies, but who shared common interests in survival and prosperity. It was exactly the kind of organization that made long-distance trading possible in such a dangerous and unstable region. With final embraces and quiet words of encouragement, Maria and Tarza rode away from the pack train as the eastern sky began to lighten. They traveled steadily eastward, following dry washes and staying to the low ground whenever possible to avoid being silhouetted against the horizon. The first day passed without incident. The horses proved to be everything Don Carlos had promised, carrying them smoothly across terrain that would have been punishing for lesser animals. Tarza rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, and Maria was impressed by how quickly he adapted to their new mounts. They made camp that evening in a small canyon that offered good concealment and access to water. As they shared a simple meal of dried meat and hardtack, Taza told Maria more about his father's final days as a free man. The stories painted a picture of a leader struggling with impossible choices, knowing that his people faced extinction but unwilling to surrender their dignity in exchange for empty promises of mercy. My father said the Americans do not understand that we are not just fighting for our land. Taza explained, his young face serious in the firelight. We are fighting for our right to exist as a people. When they take our land, they take our identity. When they take our children to their schools, they take our future. When they take our sacred places, they take our souls. Maria listened with growing understanding of the true scope of what they were attempting. The cache they sought was more than just a collection of artifacts. It was a repository of everything that made the Apache people unique, a lifeline connecting past and future generations. The second day brought their first real challenge. As they crested a ridge in the early morning, Maria spotted dust clouds on the horizon that indicated a large group of mounted men moving in their direction. Using the field glasses Don Carlos had provided, she was able to identify them as a cavalry patrol of at least 20 men, accompanied by Apache scouts. The patrol was moving along a route that would intersect with their own path within a few hours if both groups maintained their current headings. Maria quickly led Taza down into a maze of arroyos and boulder fields where they could remain hidden while the soldiers passed. They spent the entire day moving carefully from one hiding place to another, always staying ahead of the patrol but never allowing themselves to be caught in the open. The experience was nerve-wracking, but it also demonstrated to Maria how much Taza had learnt during his recovery. The boy moved with the silence and awareness of a seasoned warrior, reading the terrain and adjusting his position instinctively to maintain concealment. His Apache heritage was asserting itself, preparing him for the challenges that lay ahead. By evening, they had successfully evaded the patrol, but the encounter had cost them valuable time. They were now a half-day behind their planned schedule, which meant they would have to push harder the following day to make up the lost ground. The third day brought them into the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. The terrain became increasingly rugged, with steep slopes and narrow canyons that made travel more difficult but also provided better concealment from observers. Maria began to feel cautiously optimistic that they might reach their destination without further encounters with military patrols. That optimism proved to be premature. As they approached a narrow pass that would give them access to the eastern slopes of the mountains, they encountered evidence of a recent battle. Scattered equipment, spent cartridge cases, and the remains of a cavalry horse told the story of an engagement between soldiers and Apache warriors that had taken place within the last few days. Taza dismounted to examine the scene more closely, his face grave as he read the signs left behind by the combatants. "Free soldiers," he reported quietly. 6 Apache warriors. The fight lasted a long time, but the Apache were victorious. They took the soldiers' weapons and horses before leaving. This information was both encouraging and troubling. The presence of free Apache warriors in the area meant that resistance was continuing despite the recent setbacks. But it also meant that the entire region was now under intense scrutiny by the military, making their mission more dangerous than ever. They pressed on through the pass, entering a landscape of stunning beauty and forbidding challenge. The Dragoon Mountains rose around them like ancient monuments, their weathered peaks reaching toward a sky so blue it seemed almost artificial. Hidden among these peaks was the canyon they sought, the repository of Apache cultural treasures that could preserve a people's heritage for future generations. Using Taza's memories and the detailed map provided by Don Carlos, Maria navigated through a series of interconnected canyons, following trails so faint they were almost invisible. The boy's knowledge proved invaluable, as he remembered specific landmarks his father had described during their final conversations. Late in the afternoon of the 4th day, they found it. The rock formation that resembled a crouching jaguar stood exactly where Taza had expected, marking the entrance to a narrow canyon that wound deep into the heart of the mountains. The sound of falling water echoed faintly from the depths of the canyon, confirming that they had found the right location. But as they approached the canyon entrance, Maria spotted something that made her blood run cold. Fresh horse tracks led into the canyon, and the shoes on those horses were the distinctive pattern used by cavalry mounts. Someone else had found this place. And recently. Maria and Taza dismounted and approached the canyon entrance on foot, moving with extreme caution. The sound of voices echoing off the canyon walls confirmed their worst fears. They were not alone in this remote location. Using hand signals learned during her years as a scout, Maria indicated that they should climb to a position where they could observe the canyon without being seen. The ascent was treacherous, requiring them to move across loose rock faces and narrow ledges, but eventually they reached a vantage point that gave them a clear view of the canyon floor. What they saw there filled Maria with both rage and despair. A small detachment of soldiers had indeed found the sacred cache, and they were in the process of destroying everything they had discovered. Sacred objects were being smashed with rifle butts, while irreplaceable historical records written on hide were being burned in a large fire. The soldiers were led by a lieutenant who seemed to take particular pleasure in the destruction. Maria recognized him as one of the officers she had encountered during her work as a translator. A man known for his hatred of Apache people and his belief that their culture should be completely eradicated. Nothing left for the hostiles to come back for, the lieutenant was saying to his men as he threw another bundle of hide records onto the fire. General's orders are to destroy any Apache artifacts we find. Can't have them maintaining connections to their old ways. Maria felt Taza tense beside her as he watched the destruction of his people's heritage. The boy's hands clenched into fists, and she could see that he was fighting the urge to charge down into the canyon despite the hopeless odds. She placed a restraining hand on his shoulder, reminding him silently that they needed to remain hidden. But even as they watched the systematic destruction of irreplaceable cultural artifacts, Maria's mind was working on a plan. The soldiers were focused on their destructive work, paying little attention to security. If she and Taza could create a distraction, they might be able to salvage something from the cache before it was completely destroyed. The plan that formed in Maria's mind was dangerous to the point of being suicidal, but she could see no alternative. Too much had been lost already. The Apache people had been stripped of their land, their freedom, and their leaders. She could not stand by and watch as their history was destroyed as well. Moving carefully back from the observation point, Maria explained her plan to Taza in urgent whispers. They would split up, with Maria creating a distraction that would draw the soldiers away from the cache site. While they were occupied with pursuing her, Taza would descend into the canyon and salvage whatever he could from the remaining artifacts. The boy immediately objected to the plan, pointing out that Maria would almost certainly be captured or killed in the process, but she was adamant. His life and his knowledge were more important than her own, and this might be their only chance to preserve any portion of the Apache cultural heritage. After a brief but intense argument, Taza reluctantly agreed to the plan. Maria gave him specific instructions on what to look for among the artifacts, prioritizing items that were small enough to carry but culturally significant. Ancient ceremonial objects, historical records, and anything that contained information about traditional Apache beliefs and practices. Maria then began her own preparations. She would need to create a distraction significant enough to draw all of the soldiers away from the cache site, but she would also need to do it in a way that gave her at least some chance of escaping afterward. The solution came to her as she remembered the fresh horse tracks they had seen at the canyon entrance. The soldiers had left their mounts picketed in a small grove near the canyon mouth, guarded by a single trooper who was obviously bored with his assignment. If Maria could stampede those horses, the soldiers would have no choice but to pursue them on foot. In the confusion that followed, Taza would have his opportunity to reach the cache. The plan required precise timing and a great deal of luck, but it was the best option available under the circumstances. Maria checked her weapons one final time, made sure Taza understood his role, and began working her way down toward the horses. The guard was indeed inattentive, more interested in watching the destruction taking place in the canyon than in maintaining proper security. Maria was able to approach within a few yards of the picketed horses before she was detected. When the trooper finally noticed her presence, she was already among the animals with a burning branch she had taken from a lightning-struck tree. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The horses reared and screamed in terror as Maria waved the flaming branch among them, snapping their picket ropes and sending them galloping away in all directions. The guard shouted warnings to his comrades in the canyon, but his voice was drowned out by the thundering hooves and terrified whinnying of the fleeing animals. As Maria had hoped, every soldier in the canyon immediately abandoned what he was doing and came running toward the sound of the commotion. They found their guard trying unsuccessfully to catch one of the few horses that hadn't managed to break free, while the rest of their mounts disappeared into the maze of canyons and arroyos that surrounded them. The lieutenant was furious. screaming orders at his men to recapture the horses before they wandered too far to be found. In the chaos that followed, no one noticed the small figure that slipped down into the canyon and began gathering items from the scattered remnants of the Apache cache. Maria used the confusion to make her own escape, working her way back up the canyon walls while the soldiers were spread out searching for their missing mounts. She reached the rendezvous point she had arranged with Taza just as the boy arrived, carrying a heavy leather bag filled with salvaged artifacts. "I got what I could," he reported breathlessly. "Some of the ceremonial items, several bundles of records that weren't burned completely, and this." He held up an intricately carved piece of turquoise that seemed to glow with inner light. "My father said this was the most sacred object our people possessed. It contains the spiritual essence of all the great chiefs who came before us." Maria took the carving reverently, understanding immediately that they held something priceless beyond measure. Whatever else had been lost in the destruction below, they had preserved this link to the Apache past. Future generations would still be able to connect with their ancestral heritage through this sacred object and the other items Taza had managed to save. But their mission was far from over. The soldiers below were already organizing search parties to look for whoever had stampeded their horses. It would only be a matter of time before they discovered the missing artifacts and realized they had been robbed. The pursuit that would follow would be relentless and deadly. Maria and Taza quickly mounted their horses and began the dangerous journey back toward the south. They traveled hard for the rest of that day and well into the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the scene of their desperate gamble. The return journey proved to be even more challenging than their approach to the dragoons had been. Word of the incident at the cache site spread quickly through the military network, and patrols were dispatched to search every possible escape route. Maria found herself drawing on every skill she had learned during her years as a scout, reading the terrain and the weather patterns to stay ahead of their pursuers. On the second day of their flight south, they encountered evidence that the search for them was intensifying. Aircraft were being used to survey the desert from above, something Maria had never seen before in anti-Apache operations. The military was clearly taking this theft very seriously, understanding that the artifacts represented something more significant than mere objects. The realization that they were being hunted by forces equipped with the latest technology added a new dimension of urgency to their flight. Traditional Apache techniques for evading pursuit would be less effective against enemies who could observe their movements from the sky. Maria would need to adapt her tactics to this new reality. The solution came from an unexpected source. As they sheltered in a cave during the heat of the afternoon, waiting for the aircraft to complete their search of the area, Taza shared something his father had taught him about hiding from enemies who could see from above. "The Skywatchers can see movement in horses," the boy explained, "but they cannot see through solid rock. The old ones knew this, and they built hidden paths through the mountains that cannot be seen from above. If we can find these paths, we can travel without being detected." It was exactly the kind of traditional knowledge that Maria had hoped they might preserve by recovering the cache. The irony was not lost on her that they were now using that very knowledge to escape with the artifacts they had risked everything to obtain. Following Taza's guidance, they began traveling through a network of natural tunnels and covered passages that honeycombed the desert mountains. These routes were known only to the Apache, passed down through generations of warriors who had used them to move unseen through their traditional territory. The hidden paths were difficult to navigate and often dangerous, requiring them to lead their horses through passages so narrow that the animals could barely fit, but they were completely invisible from above, allowing Maria and Taza to travel undetected while search aircraft circled overhead. On the fourth day after leaving the Dragoon Mountains, they finally encountered the signal they had been hoping to see. A thin column of smoke rising from a distant peak told them that Don Carlos and his pack train were camped nearby, waiting for their return. The old trader had kept his promise to wait for them, despite the obvious risks involved in remaining in one location for an extended period. The reunion was emotional for everyone involved. Don Carlos had been increasingly worried as the days passed without word from Maria and Taza, and he was relieved to see them return safely with their precious cargo. The other members of the pack train welcomed them back warmly, though they were careful not to ask too many questions about where they had been or what they had accomplished. That evening, as the pack train prepared to resume its southward journey, Maria took the opportunity to examine more carefully the artifacts Taza had managed to salvage from the destroyed cache. Each item told the story of Apache history and culture that would have been lost forever if not for the boys' quick thinking and courage. Among the rescued items were several pieces of intricately worked silver jewelry that had belonged to famous Apache leaders, bundles of written records that documented traditional ceremonies and beliefs, and a collection of small carved figures that represented the spiritual guardians of various Apache clans. But the most significant item was undoubtedly the turquoise carving that Taza had identified as the most sacred object of his people. As Maria held the carving, she felt a connection to something larger than herself or her immediate circumstances. This object had been touched by generations of Apache leaders, had witnessed the rise and fall of their civilization, and would continue to serve as a link between past and future long after everyone currently alive had passed into memory. The weight of responsibility for protecting these artifacts was enormous, but Maria found herself strengthened rather than burdened by it. She had discovered a purpose that transcended her own survival or comfort, a mission that connected her to the sweep of history and the ongoing struggle for cultural preservation. But even as she celebrated the success of their desperate gamble in the Dragoon Mountains, Maria knew that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. They were still hundreds of miles from the safety of the Mexican Apache strongholds, and the military forces hunting them would not give up easily. The artifacts they carried made them incredibly valuable targets, and the authorities would spare no effort to recapture what had been stolen from them. The next phase of their journey would take them through some of the most dangerous territory in the Southwest, past military outposts and through regions where Apache raids had created an atmosphere of constant vigilance and hostility. Every mile would bring new risks and new challenges that would test their resolve and their ingenuity. But as Maria looked at Taza, now sleeping peacefully beside the fire with the sacred artifacts close at hand, she felt a sense of confidence that surprised her with its strength. They had already accomplished what had seemed impossible, penetrating deep into enemy territory and recovering treasures that everyone else had given up for lost. The boy who had been a traumatized victim when she first found him was transforming into something remarkable. His natural intelligence and courage were being shaped by the experiences they had shared, forging him into someone who might indeed prove capable of leading his people back from the brink of extinction. Tomorrow would bring new dangers and new challenges as they continued their flight toward the sanctuary of the Mexican mountains. But tonight, Maria allowed herself to feel a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had preserved something precious and irreplaceable, and that achievement would resonate through the generations regardless of what happened to them personally. The Mexican border shimmered in the distance like a mirage, wavering in the intense heat that rose from the desert floor. Maria wiped sweat from her eyes as she studied the terrain ahead through Don Carlos's field glasses. After 6 weeks of traveling with the pack train, they were finally approaching the end of their journey with the traders. Soon she and Taza would have to strike out on their own again for the final and most dangerous leg of their odyssey. The weeks since leaving the Dragoon Mountains had been filled with constant tension. Military patrols had increased dramatically throughout the region, and twice they had been forced to hide the pack train in remote canyons while large cavalry formations swept through the area. Each time, Maria had wondered if their pursuers had finally picked up their trail, but somehow they had managed to remain undetected. Taza had grown stronger and more confident during these weeks on the trail. The traumatized child Maria had rescued was gone, replaced by a young man who carried himself with the dignity of someone destined for leadership. He had spent countless hours listening to the stories told around the evening campfires, absorbing knowledge about the broader world that would serve him well in the years to come. The sacred artifacts they had rescued from the Dragoon Mountains remained safely hidden among the pack train's supplies, disguised as trade goods that would attract no special attention. Maria had divided the collection into several smaller bundles to reduce the risk of losing everything if they were discovered. The most precious items, including the sacred turquoise carving, were concealed in a specially constructed hiding place in her own pack. Don Carlos had proven to be more than just a helpful ally during their journey. The old trader possessed an extensive network of contacts throughout the borderlands, and he had used these connections to gather intelligence about the military operations being conducted against Apache refugees. The information he provided had been invaluable in helping them avoid the numerous patrols that crisscrossed their route. But now they were approaching the point where even Don Carlos could no longer help them. The Mexican Apache bands they sought lived in some of the most remote and inaccessible terrain on the continent, in mountain strongholds that were deliberately difficult to reach. No pack train could navigate the narrow trails and steep precipices that guarded these sanctuaries. On their final evening with the traders, Don Carlos took Maria aside for a private conversation. They walked away from the main camp to a small hill overlooking the valley where the pack train had stopped for the night. The lights of a Mexican border town twinkled in the distance, promising civilization and relative safety for those who belonged there. Tomorrow our paths must diverge, Don Carlos said quietly, his weathered face serious in the starlight. I have given you everything I can to help with the next phase of your journey. Maps, supplies, and contacts who can guide you through the most difficult terrain. But from this point forward, you will be entirely on your own. Maria nodded, understanding the gravity of what lay ahead. You have already done more than we had any right to expect. Tarza and I will never forget your kindness and courage in helping us. The old trader smiled sadly. I hope that one day I will hear stories of the great leader Tarza became, and know that our small part in his survival made a difference. But I must also tell you that I fear for your safety in the weeks to come. The Sierra Madre Mountains are beautiful but deadly, and the Mexican Apache bands are not always welcoming to strangers. We will face whatever challenges await us, Maria replied with more confidence than she actually felt. The alternative is to abandon everything we have worked for, and that is not acceptable. Don Carlos reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather pouch. One final gift, he said, pressing it into Maria's hands. This contains letters of introduction to several people who might be able to help you in Mexico. Some are traders like myself. Others are government officials who can be trusted to look the other way when necessary. Use them carefully, but use them if you must. That night, Maria lay awake staring at the stars and thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. In just a few months, her entire life had been transformed. She had gone from being a simple scout and translator to becoming the guardian of Apache cultural treasures and the protector of a future chief. The responsibilities were overwhelming, but she had discovered reserves of strength and determination that she never knew she possessed. Beside her, Tarza slept peacefully, but Maria could see that he was dreaming. His face moved with expressions of concern and determination that reflected the burdens he carried even in sleep. The boy had aged years in just a few months, forced to grow up far too quickly by the circumstances that had thrust leadership upon him at such a young age. The next morning brought emotional farewells as Maria and Tarza prepared to leave the pack train. The traders had become like family during their weeks together, and the separation was painful for everyone involved. Don Carlos provided them with 2 fresh horses and enough supplies for several weeks of independent travel, refusing to accept any payment despite Maria's protests. The debt I owed to Naiche can never be fully repaid, he explained, as he helped them load their packs. But perhaps this small contribution to his son's survival will bring me some measure of peace. As the pack train disappeared into the desert haze, heading toward the safety and prosperity of the Mexican trading centers, Maria and Tarza turned south toward the towering peaks of the Sierra Madre. The mountains rose before them like a wall of stone and snow, beautiful but forbidding in their stark majesty. The first few days of independent travel passed without serious incident. They followed well-established trails that connected the various settlements scattered throughout the border region, moving steadily toward the mountains while maintaining the cover story that they were Mexican citizens visiting relatives in remote villages. But as they climbed higher into the foothills, the nature of their journey began to change dramatically. The trails became narrower and more treacherous, winding along precipitous cliff faces and through passes so steep that they had to dismount and lead their horses much of the time. The air grew thinner and colder, and Maria found herself struggling to adjust to the altitude. Tarza, however, seemed to thrive in the mountain environment. His Apache heritage had prepared him for this kind of terrain, and he moved with confidence and grace despite the challenging conditions. More than once, Maria found herself relying on his instincts and natural abilities to navigate passages that would have been impossible for her to manage alone. On the 4th day after leaving the pack train, they encountered their first real test. As they approached a narrow canyon that supposedly contained a hidden trail to the upper reaches of the mountains, they discovered that they were not alone. A group of Mexican soldiers had established a checkpoint at the canyon entrance, questioning all travelers and searching their belongings for contraband. Maria and Tarza observed the checkpoint from a concealed position among the rocks, studying the soldiers' procedures and looking for weaknesses they might exploit. The situation was complicated by the fact that they were carrying the Apache artifacts, which would certainly be confiscated if discovered. Worse yet, Tarza's identity might be recognized if the soldiers had access to the wanted posters that were circulating throughout the region. After several hours of observation, Maria concluded that there was no way to pass through the checkpoint without risking exposure. They would have to find an alternative route, even if it meant adding days to their journey through some of the most difficult terrain in the mountains. The detour they were forced to take led them through a series of interconnected canyons that wound deep into the heart of the Sierra Madre. The going was slow and treacherous, with frequent rock slides and flash flood zones that made progress dangerous and unpredictable. But the route also offered something unexpected: their first contact with the Mexican Apache bands they sought. The encounter came without warning. As they rounded a bend in a narrow canyon, one moment they were alone in the wilderness, and the next they were surrounded by Apache warriors who had materialized from the rocks as if by magic. Maria's heart pounded as she realized how easily they could have been killed without ever knowing their attackers were there. The leader of the Apache group was a man of middle years whose face bore the scars of countless battles. He studied Maria and Taza with eyes that seemed to see everything, taking in every detail of their appearance and equipment. When he spoke, it was in fluent Spanish, though Maria suspected he was equally comfortable in English and several Apache dialects. "You are traveling in dangerous country," he said, his tone neutral but not threatening. "Few people come this way unless they are lost or running from something." "Which are you?" Maria considered her response carefully, knowing that their lives might depend on saying the right words. "We are seeking the free Apache bands that live in these mountains," she replied honestly. "We carry something that belongs to your people, something that must be preserved for future generations." The warrior's eyes shifted to Taza, and Maria saw a flicker of recognition cross his features. "And who is this boy that travels with you? He has the look of the Chiricahua about him." "I am Taza, son of Naichi," the boy replied before Maria could speak. "My father was captured by the Americans, and I carried the sacred objects he entrusted to me before his defeat." The effect of this announcement on the Apache warriors was immediate and dramatic. Several of them drew closer, studying Taza's features with intense interest. Their leader's expression softened slightly as he recognized the truth in the boy's words. "I knew your father when we were both young men," he said quietly. "We fought together against the Mexicans in the old days, before the Americans came with their broken promises and their hunger for our land. If you are truly his son, then you are welcome among us." The relief Maria felt was overwhelming. After months of constant danger and uncertainty, they had finally found sanctuary among people who would understand and appreciate the true value of what they carried. But as the Apache warriors escorted them deeper into the mountains, she began to realize that their journey was far from over. The Mexican Apache bands, she learned, were not a single unified group, but rather a collection of separate clans that sometimes cooperated and sometimes competed with each other. Each clan controlled its own territory within the vast mountain wilderness, and traveling between their settlements required careful negotiation and diplomatic skill. More challenging still was the revelation that not all of the Apache bands were sympathetic to refugees from the American campaigns. Some had made their own accommodations with the Mexican government and were reluctant to harbor fugitives who might bring unwanted attention from either Mexican or American military forces. The clan that had found them was led by a chief named Victorio, grandson of the famous war leader of the same name. He agreed to provide them with temporary shelter, while they made contact with other clan leaders who might be willing to accept them permanently. But he also made it clear that they could not remain in his territory indefinitely without creating problems for his people. The temporary camp where they were taken was hidden in a box canyon so remote and well concealed that Maria marveled at the ingenuity required to build and maintain it. Wickiups were scattered among the rocks and trees in a pattern that made them almost invisible from above, and the entire settlement could be abandoned and relocated within a matter of hours if necessary. The Apache families living in the camp welcomed Taza with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. Word of his identity spread quickly through the settlement, and soon he was surrounded by people eager to hear news of the Chiricahua resistance and the fate of the leaders they had known in better times. For Maria, the experience was both wonderful and heartbreaking. She watched as Taza reconnected with his cultural heritage, learning traditional songs and stories that had been passed down through generations of Apache oral tradition. But she also saw the sorrow in the faces of the older people as they realized how much had been lost in the American conquest of their homeland. The sacred artifacts they had rescued from the Dragoon Mountains were received with a reverence that confirmed their importance. When Taza finally revealed the turquoise carving that his father had identified as the most sacred object of the Chiricahua people, several of the elders wept openly. They had believed that all such treasures had been lost forever, destroyed or stolen by the American military. But even as they celebrated the preservation of these cultural treasures, the Apache leaders were divided about what to do with Taza himself. Some argued that he should be hidden away in the deepest parts of the mountains, protected from any possibility of capture or discovery. Others believed that he should be trained in traditional Apache ways so that he could eventually return to lead the scattered remnants of his father's people. The debate continued for several days while messengers carried word of Taz's arrival to other Apache settlements throughout the region. Maria found herself in the strange position of being an honored guest but also an outsider whose opinion carried little weight in decisions that would determine the boy's future. The resolution came from an unexpected source. A messenger arrived from the most remote and traditional of the Apache clans, a group that had maintained almost complete independence from both the Mexican and American governments. Their elderly chief, a man known throughout the region for his wisdom and spiritual power, had requested that Taza be brought to him for evaluation. "This is a great honor," Victorio explained to Maria as they prepared for the journey to the remote clan's territory. "The Old One rarely involves himself in the affairs of refugees or political matters. If he is asked to see the boy, it means he believes there is something special about Taza's destiny." The journey to meet the Old One took them even deeper into the mountains, following trails so faint and difficult that Maria wondered how anyone could navigate them without years of experience. But their Apache guides moved with confidence through terrain that seemed impassable, leading them ever higher into regions where the air was thin and the peaks were crowned with snow even in summer. The settlement of the traditional clan was unlike anything Maria had ever seen. Instead of the temporary structures she had observed in other Apache camps, these people lived in permanent buildings constructed from stone and timber that blended seamlessly into the natural landscape. Gardens and irrigation systems showed evidence of agricultural knowledge that went back centuries, and the entire community radiated an air of stability and continuity that had survived despite all the upheavals of recent history. The Old One himself was a figure from legend, a man so aged that his exact years were unknown even to his own people. But his eyes were sharp and alert, and when he looked at Taza, Maria felt that he was seeing not just the boy himself, but all the possibilities that his future might contain. The evaluation process lasted for 3 days. The Old One tested Taza's knowledge of Apache history and tradition, his understanding of leadership principles, and his commitment to preserving the cultural heritage of his people. He also examined the sacred artifacts they had brought, handling each item with a reverence that spoke to his deep spiritual connection to Apache traditions. When the testing was complete, the Old One rendered his judgment in a ceremony that brought together representatives from all the Apache clans in the region. His words, spoken in formal Apache ceremonial language and then translated into Spanish for Maria's benefit, would determine the course of the rest of their lives. "This boy carries within him the spirit of the great chiefs who came before him," the Old One declared. "But he also carries the knowledge of the new world that his people must learn to navigate if they are to survive. He must be trained not just as a traditional Apache leader, but as someone who can bridge the gap between the old ways and the new realities." The decision was made to establish a special school in the most remote part of the mountains, where Taza would be educated by the wisest teachers from all the Apache clans. He would learn traditional skills like hunting, warfare, and spiritual practices, but he would also study modern subjects like reading, writing, mathematics, and politics. The goal was to prepare him to lead his people in a world that would require both traditional wisdom and contemporary knowledge. For Maria, the Old One had a different destiny in mind. "You have proven your loyalty to the Apache people beyond any doubt," he told her during a private ceremony. "You will be adopted into our nation as a full member, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Your knowledge of the outside world will be valuable in the difficult years that lie ahead." The adoption ceremony was one of the most moving experiences of Maria's life. Standing before the assembled elders of all the Apache clans, she was formally welcomed into a people who had lost so much but who still maintained their dignity and their hope for the future. The sacred objects they had rescued from the Dragoon Mountains were placed in a specially constructed shrine, where they would be preserved for all future generations. As the months passed and Taza began his education under the guidance of the Apache elders, Maria found herself settling into a new life that she could never have imagined when she first found the injured boy in the destroyed camp. She became a teacher herself, sharing her knowledge of the outside world with young Apache men and women who would one day serve as scouts, negotiators, and cultural ambassadors for their people. The school that was established for Taza's education gradually expanded to include other young Apache people from throughout the region. Word spread through the informal networks that connected Apache communities across the Southwest. and families began sending their brightest children to learn the skills they would need to help their people survive in the modern world. But even as they built for the future, the past remained a constant presence in their daily lives. The sacred artifacts in the shrine served as a reminder of everything that had been lost, but also of everything that still survived. The stories and traditions preserved in those rescued objects became the foundation for a cultural renaissance that spread throughout the Apache communities in the Sierra Madre. Years passed, and Taza grew into the leader that everyone had hoped he would become. But he was not the traditional Apache chief that his father had been. Instead, he became something new, a bridge between worlds. Someone who could speak equally well in the council lodges of his people and in the government offices of Mexico and the United States. Under his eventual leadership, the Mexican Apache bands were able to negotiate a unique status that gave them autonomy within their mountain territories while maintaining peaceful relationships with the outside world. They became known throughout the region as skilled guides, craftsmen, and traders, building an economic foundation that allowed their communities to thrive without losing their cultural identity. The secret that had seemed so stunning when Maria first discovered Taza's identity had indeed proved to be transformative, but not in the way anyone could have predicted. Instead of simply preserving the past, they had used that preserved heritage as the foundation for building a new kind of future. Maria lived to see Taza become a respected leader, not just among the Apache people, but throughout the borderlands. She watched as the young man she had rescued grew into someone who could negotiate with government officials, lead his people with wisdom and compassion, and preserve their cultural heritage while adapting to the realities of the modern world. The turquoise carving that had been the most sacred of all the rescued artifacts found its permanent home in a shrine that became a pilgrimage destination for Apache people from throughout North America. The stories and traditions preserved in the other rescued objects were recorded in books that ensured they would never be lost again, regardless of what political upheavals might occur in the future. When Maria died many years later, she was honored as one of the great heroes of Apache history. Her story became part of the oral tradition that was passed down through the generations, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely people can become the instruments of cultural preservation and renewal. The school she had helped to establish continued to operate long after her death, sending out graduates who became teachers, leaders, and cultural preservationists in Apache communities throughout the Americas. The model they had developed of combining traditional knowledge with modern education was eventually adopted by indigenous communities around the world. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Maria's desperate journey across enemy territory was the proof it provided that cultural heritage, once thought lost forever, could be recovered and renewed by people with enough courage and determination to risk everything for their beliefs. The sacred objects in the shrine continued to inspire new generations of Apache people, reminding them that their ancestors' wisdom and traditions remained relevant and powerful in the modern world. The stunning secret of Taza's identity had indeed changed the course of history, but not through the dramatic military victories that his father's generation had sought. Instead, it had led to something more subtle but ultimately more powerful: the creation of a new model for indigenous survival and renewal that showed how traditional cultures could adapt and thrive in the face of overwhelming external pressure. As the sun set over the Sierra Madre Mountains many decades after Maria's first desperate flight with the injured boy, the Apache communities she had helped to save continued to flourish in their mountain strongholds. Their children learned the old stories and the new skills with equal dedication, preparing to face whatever challenges the future might bring, with the wisdom of their ancestors and the knowledge of the modern world combined in perfect balance. The legacy of that incredible journey across enemy territory lived on in every generation, a testament to the power of individual courage and determination to change the course of history and preserve the irreplaceable treasures of human culture for all who would come after.